Welcome to Mentor. I'm Marco Bertozzi.
And I'm Rachel Ford.
We've got a special one today.
Yeah.
We were lucky enough to find time in the diary of Steve King.
At one point,
he was basically number two in Publicis.
Yeah, Maurice Lévy's number two.
I think for me, the insights he gave us around working for Maurice Lévy, Arthur Sadoun, were like, everyone wants to know what it's like working for those people, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And what they're like. So,
but especially around the success of Publicis Group. I thought, not to give too much away, but obviously winning was incredibly important. But there was another side of that equation that was really showed the competitive edge of those both amazing people within advertising.
Well, you might, if you listen, you might find out what was the one event in his diary that he protected vehemently every week.
Finally, though, and I think this is important, that even Steve King has imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Really, Steve? But anyway, that was really enlightening when he was really open and honest. So, yeah.
That was a big surprise, let's be honest.
But before we dive into that, something that's kind of around the news at the moment is around, well, we are a media podcast, journalism and the protection of that journalism. And there's a whole campaign around
Make It Fair.
Make It Fair, which is a collaboration between the Mail, the Telegraph, the Guardian.
Basically, relatively unheard of for them all to get together, which is great to see. And really coming together because I think the government is lining up some sort of easing of AI rules, which would mean that basically all these AI companies can go around sucking up all the information on the internet, including premium journalism, without any sort of sense of payment or licensing. And they're quite rightly very worried about that.
So the UK government is considering allowing AI to literally scrape this journalism for free and
train their models, whatever their AI. Large language models.
Well, we work in media marketing and advertising and proper journalism, and there's so much, away from the fake news. Already these big newspaper groups and publishers are already fighting against, the likes of, Meta and TikTok, etc., for advertising revenue, which is obviously a way to fund proper journalism. But if
they're also caught up in brand safety, where brands are steering away from news because they're worried about, brand reputation risk, which is, just a complete exaggeration on the part of the advertisers. But so they're getting hit from all sides. So it's nice to see it come together. And the reality is, if journalism is put out of business, then what we're left with, like what is, the quality of news, the quality of insight and information in the world is just going to be on a free fall over time. So it's great to see them all come together and try and make a bit of a stand on this.
Yeah, and I think even for the younger generations, I think they want to turn to these established news brands to get the proper information. And if we're just constantly taking away the opportunity to raise funds, because so if they're actually fairly paid for this journalism, they're not fighting against AI necessarily. It's not anti-AI, is it?
No.
It's not anti-AI. It's actually about how do we protect proper journalism and make sure that proper journalism is paid for.
It's all great. In some respects, it's all creativity. It's the same as music. It's the same as how the music industry fought to get fairly paid for what they produce in the face of the Spotifys and all the music streaming companies, basically. And so it's that, sort of being revisited, but for journalism. Yeah. And it's not going to be an easy fight for them, but the best place to start, I think, is by
together.
Joining forces. Yeah.
I think we're ready to invite Steve in, aren't we?
Let's get Steve in.
Yeah, let's get you in. So our guest today is Steve King, and his career is a masterclass in longevity, leadership and transformation in the media industry.
And maybe survival.
We'll hear about that later, maybe. But both Marco and I worked under your leadership when you created Zenith UK, and we were based in Paddington. I think you've come a long way since.
Paddington.
Yeah, the North Wharf Road.
At the same time.
Yeah. North Wharf Road.
Where we met.
With the blue windows.
Mid-90s.
But, you have stayed loyal and ahead of the game for 4 decades. And as the longest serving member of the Publicis Management Committee, Steve is cited by Maurice Lévy, no less, as instrumental in driving much of the success that the group has achieved over the years. And we'll hear that today. But first of all, welcome, Steve. We are really delighted.
Very nice to be here.
I mean, we can't believe you actually.
It's very hard. It's very hard, I think, interviewing someone that has sort of mercilessly took the piss out of you for 25 years. But we're going to try.
Stop now.
Well, exactly. Do your best today, Steve. We are, no holds barred. But how's your day gone? I mean, we arrived here. You're still on the phone. Still on the phone.
Yeah.
Still on a call.
Well, I had, having left, as you're going to come on and talk about, Publicis after effectively one employer for sort of more than 30 years. I sort of didn't know what I was going to do on the 1st of January. And I've fallen into 2 or 3 new roles, and arguably I'm busier now than I was previously. The great thing, given that I'm doing, different roles, very different from what I was doing previously, despite my very advanced age, I'm learning lots of new stuff. So it's a bit like you two, when you set up your business, I'm sure you're learning curve. And that's great. I say to everybody, anybody.
It's energizing.
When people come to me and say, oh, what should I do? I said, basically my mantra, even though I was very loyal and stayed in one company, by luck or good fortune or happens chance, I basically change roles without exception every 3 or 4 years. And I say to everybody, if you are in the same role for more than 4 years, you really need to think about agitating for change.
You're in a role.
And I feel really grateful that I'm still learning stuff. My father, who stopped work on his 65th birthday and never worked again. And that was, he was in the building trade. And that just wasn't for me. And I sort of wanted to be energised and not sitting at home. And moreover, my wife, who's barely seen me for the last 30 years, so I was always at
Didn't
home.
want you home, did she?
Particularly when we had 5 young kids. She said, do you have to go off to the US this weekend? She certainly, she married me, as we say, for richer, for poorer, but never for lunch.
And you're not a man to sit still, are you? I can't imagine you being at home sitting still.
No, I don't know whether that's a strength or weakness. No, I couldn't sit. My mantra is I didn't want to be sitting at home watching Countdown.
Yeah. Nothing against Countdown, but I agree.
Oh, nothing against Countdown. I love it. And there are other programmes that are excellent. Or the One Show.
Yeah, we like.
I mean, I don't think we can, we don't have enough time with everyone we've spoken to, but I think particularly with you, Steve, the impact you had at Publicis was significant, and we'll come back to that. But let's just have an attempt, as we ask all our guests, for those that maybe don't know you particularly well, your career right from the start.
Yeah, start from the beginning.
60 seconds or so.
Yeah. Tough to do in 60 seconds.
Well, you can have 90.
Okay. I left college. Did business studies, left in a terrible economic downturn, went off, there were no jobs for graduates.
Can we date it just for?
Early 80s.
Right.
And then went off and I sort of invented the gap year and went off and was selling all sorts of things, selling donuts in the south of France, earrings in Italy, did various things, came back and got jobs selling advertising. It was commission only for various titles.
And how did you how was that just a job you saw advertised?
Well, you won't know this. In the day, there used to be a thing called the Evening Standard with ads in it. And you'd look it up and you literally rang them up. And and it was selling, and I was selling a thing for the London Review and then a thing called Surrey Villager. See, I've used my 60 seconds. I'm only up to the first year. Anyway, and then I was selling advertising space in a magazine called the Surrey Villager, and the magazine was going bankrupt and bust. And I was selling to a BMW garage. And the guy said, well, why am I going to advertise? It's the last ever publication. I said, the thing is, people are going to keep this last magazine as a memento. It's going to last forever. So your value, your ROI you're going to get out of this is going to be fantastic. And he said, really? Anyway, he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, the TV companies are expanding and they're all employing graduates for the first time. And why don't you apply to one of those? And that was because of Star Channel 4. And if you remember the ITV companies. So lots of us, if you know my peer group, lots of us started at exactly the same time. And there's a whole group of ne'er-do-wells all started at HTV, which is where I started, in Baker Street, myself, Robert Ditcham, Ilka Shakir, Mick Desmond, Nick Theakston, Barry Llewellyn, you'll know most of those names. We all started in that first sort of graduate trainee scheme, which most of the time involved drinking beer in the pub at lunchtime.
Well, that was standard.
Can you believe
lunchtime drinking.
Oh my God, we used to do that.
Great
Dudley.
thing. Great
Dudley
thing.
in Paddington.
And Anyway, and then I went there, and then I was employed to go work there for 2 years, and left. And very importantly, after I left, I started dating my Mrs. King, Kerry, who was also working at HTV, and got married a couple of years later. Anyway, I then went to Dorland, which was Bates, one of the biggest, which became one of the real tear, and that begat Zenith. Zenith was the first media dependent, and I was one of, I think, the 5 or 6 directors at the start of that company. So, and you'll know, obviously, the other, you would obviously know the other 4 or 5. And from there, I think I then led TV buying. I think the role I had, and then I became deputy MD, I think MD, and then, most significantly, for reasons best known to themselves, I was offered the job of going to the US and helping lead the creation of Zenith in the US. And I'd never been to New York, never been to the US, and my wife had an aversion and a fear of flying. So this was back. I remember we went to the pub and we said, "We've got to do it."
Yeah,
of course you've got to do it. Yeah. And that was definitely the biggest decision I ever made. It was a fantastic opportunity. It nearly killed me, that 3 or 4 years I spent in the US. Yeah. We had a CEO. I went there as the number 2. The CEO left after a year, and I found myself running around the US, going to see clients, in meetings. But I'd sit in meetings. I really was completely unqualified to do that job, and I'd sit in a meeting and we'd say, we need to unify the 401k plan. And I'd sit there for 2 hours. And at the end of it, I'd say to our CFO, "What is a 401k plan?" And she'd go, "You must know what that is." How would I know that? I never learned that at Thames Poly or at HTV or at Bates. Anyway, that was an incredible time. And as you know, Marco, it's, I think, particularly today, actually, the way the world has gravitated around the US, it's really hard to be a credible leader if you haven't spent time working with US clients, working with
They don't take you seriously, really.
And, as you know, I then went on to actually work there 3 separate times. Moved there that first time. That was with my wife, Carrie, and 3 very, very young daughters. And then, as you know, we... something unbelievable happened and we had twins. So we ended up with 5 kids there. Which was a real challenge. I'm flying around the US the whole time.
Yeah, can I go back to that point, like that time? Because obviously a key moment in your career, but would you go back and advise yourself to do anything differently, or would you do it all exactly?
No, I would absolutely. And I often think back of the dozens or hundreds of people that I've asked to relocate to other countries, other markets, take on new roles. And really, I can only think of 1 or 2 cases where that hasn't been beneficial to the individual for their career and also for their personal situation. 1 or 2 exceptions. And that accelerated learning you get by being in a really, really difficult, challenging role. I mean, I was literally dealing, that's the point I was making at the beginning, learning stuff all the time.
Yeah. In at the deep end.
And what did I know about buying IT systems or renting retail space or merging companies or dealing with different cultures? Yeah. No, it was incredibly rich.
How would you, when you think about that, how would you, because we hear a lot about imposter syndrome nowadays, don't we? And
we do.
How
I'm
people...
a great example of that.
It's normally focused on...
Oh, my God. I mean, the whole time.
Yeah, so how do you deal with that? What's your... How would you help... We're obviously... focused on anyone who's listening thinking, I'm about to go into that situation, I want to go in that situation, but how have you managed that through those, whichever roles those have been?
Well, I think, when I was working with much older people and I'd go into a meeting and I would be the young bag carrier and someone of my age would be talking to a client. And I thought, this guy or lady, they don't know what they're talking about. And but because they had age and status, the clients used to go, "Oh, really?" Because he's got CEO or chairman title, then he must know what he's talking about. And I think, one of the things I learned early is the most important thing definitely is to listen. You have to listen well. Don't try and sit in a meeting and be, I'm the big I am. And certainly I think, I think we all have imposter syndrome to some perspective, some level. I certainly had that, particularly going to new markets and new territories. So I would tend to try and understand what the clients want, try and understand, and definitely spend more time listening rather than talking at people.
That comes through quite a lot, 2 ears, 1 mouth. I think if we can just remember that. And if you haven't got anything, intelligent to say, just don't say it at all.
And interestingly, really, if you think my career, really, I sort of worked indirectly or directly for 2 Morrises. So I worked for Maurice Lévy, obviously, and indirectly, and he was actually the one I went to go and see, and he said, you need to go to the US, and at the time he sold me this story, the US clients are completely behind this, the media vendors are absolutely hungering for an independent media organisation, and of course the agency management are desperate to have their most profitable part of the business taken out, and of course all of this turned out to be completely incorrect, and of course, it was one of my learnings that senior management, and they're desperate for someone to take on a job, they'll mislead you, and that's what happened. So that was Maurice Lévy, and then of course we were a subsidiary of Saatchi & Saatchi. Saatchi & Saatchi then went through its financial implosion, which you remember in the 90s, late 90s. And Zenith then became a JV, joint venture, between 2 warring holding companies. Yeah. One was Cordian, which was the owner of Bates, and the other was Saatchi & Saatchi. And that was really the reason I moved back to the UK, because I knew that there was going to be change. You remember our chairman, my boss, John Paris, he was about to step away from the business. And I thought, it's probably from a career point of view, it was probably best to be back in HQ. But interesting, we made that decision, my wife and I, to go to the US like that. And we agonized whether to come back. And anyway, we were a JV, part of a JV. The 2 shareholders actually had considered us for different things. One wanted us for the asset value, the other one wanted for the dividend stream. So we couldn't really get any cohesion or clarity on our management. So it's really tough. We were having discussions with all sorts of external partners, whether we'd be acquired or merged. Against his better wishes, Maurice Lévy asked me to take over Zenith. And then then, if you remember, we merged with Optimedia, which was the Publicis in-house agency. So I became the CEO of Zenith Optimedia.
I remember the party.
Very imaginative. We had one company called Zenith and one was called Optimedia. Where we went away. What should we call this company? Because we're all about clarity of branding. We decided to call it Zenith Optimedia. Well, I thought of that. Then, if you remember, one of the things I had learned, funny enough, from the short-lived chairman in the US when I was there, a really nice gentleman, guy called Bill Grimes. He said, look, when you're in a business, in a competitive set, you've got to have a real distinct positioning about the business. I never thought of that before. And you've got to have a clear mission statement. And you'll remember that at the time, everyone was saying, what's Zenith about? It's all about buying prowess. And we were in the intro, we were talking about Anthony Young, and I did a trip out to Asia, and I started talking to clients, and I remember we had a sort of round table dinner, and I said to Anthony, he said, well, you're the most senior guest, so, the clients want to hear about what's important. I said, well, what do the clients want to hear about? And he said, they want to hear about ROI, how we can help them. I said, what's that, Anthony? Turn on investment. Oh, that's good. Anyway, I found myself after dinner talking about ROI, and the clients, I always remember, particularly the P&G client at the time, he said, oh, that is great. If you could help us deliver that. And if you remember, I don't know if you were there then, I think.
Yeah, we were.
And we came back and I said, right, that's going to be our mantra.
We're the ROI.
And that, I remember our competitors saying, what do you mean? We all deliver ROI.
It caused a stir.
Because everyone said, why can you? And I said, well, we're going to own that. Yeah. And it was such a good learning and such a great, and you'll know that from then on, everything that we did, whether it was recruiting people, whether it was training people, whether it was the tools or platforms we were developing, how we present ourselves to new business, it always had an ROI centricity about it. Yeah. And that was Zenith then. And I don't know, 25 years later, Zenith still today is the ROI agency in every other market in the world. And sometimes I will interview people from our competitors and go, well, are you really the ROI agency? And they'll come from Mindshare or Omnicom or somewhere else. I go, well, what's the positioning for your agency? 9 out of 10 of the people I employ, some of them very, very senior, will not know what the positioning is of their own company. And we'll come on to Publicis Media in my 90 seconds. And,
how's that going?
It's good. It's good, thanks.
90 minutes.
90 minutes. And but that positioning was something I learned well in the US, and because when you're in the what we do now is so complicated, but it's so important that you had real clarity of purpose and direction, because there are hundreds of agencies, hundreds of digital agencies, hundreds of recruitment agencies, hundreds of headhunters. You know, whatever business you're in, you really need to have a clarity that everyone in the organisation understands.
Yeah.
So that was Zenith Optimedia, and I joined the board of Publicis at the time that we were acquired by Publicis and became 100%. And, you know, it was tough working for the French in Paris. But obviously that's a relationship that endured for more than 20 years. Very, very different working, having worked for Brits in Britain, having worked with Americans and then working in Paris, and incredible.
What's your take?
Yeah.
So I guess I'd like to ask the specific question of, you know, tell us a bit about your relationship with Maurice and working with him, but maybe to broaden it out around what are your takeaways from sort of US management, French management, UK management?
I mean, I'll talk about what I see more generally in the US.
Yeah.
And it tends to be that US management tends to be more hierarchical.
Yes.
You know, so it's much more, you know, salute the flag.
You're the boss.
You know, and if you're the boss, and I say to anyone who's going to take on a senior role in the US, it's fine as long as you're controlling or you're managing the people. If you go in some sort of ancillary support role, as you had once, it's really, really tough to prevail.
Yeah.
People, you know, it's like an army. You know, they'll follow the general.
Yeah.
French is much more open, discursive, but definitely, you know, where, particularly in the case of Maurice and now with Arthur, you know, the absolute commitment, absolute 100% passion to succeed. And in fact, funny enough, both my two Maurices, Maurice Sarchi and Maurice Lévy, avowed competitors, opponents, enemies even in business. You know, I've heard them both say the same mantra. It's not just enough that you've got to win. Somebody else has got to lose. And they both come from that absolutely rabid competitiveness. And certainly in the case of Maurice, you know, the audacity and bravery to make some of the acquisitions, you know, buying Sarchi and Sarchi, then Leo Burnett, you know, when you go to Chicago, it's the only dog in town.
Yeah,
you know,
it's
the most iconic US agency, and not crushing that spirit or creativity, you know, and as you know, it was, you know, vive la différence, you know, that was it, you know, celebrating the differences of different cultures and different brands. And, you know, and I remember joining that Publicis board, and I certainly had that imposter syndrome because I'm working with these titans of the advertising world, from Leo and Sarchi's and Becom3 and Darcy. And I am absolutely convinced there is no other CEO of a holdco who works as hard as Maurice Lévy did. There's only one person I've seen work as hard as that, and that's Arthur. And, you know, that passion and commitment with clients, that relentless competitiveness is incredible, and that endures throughout the whole organisation.
So how do you adapt to people, or don't you adapt? Are you just, Steve, this is how I am, I'd take it or leave it, or have you had to adapt to, you know, some of these?
I think you've had to do both. You know, you can't pretend to be one thing to one person. I think everybody who knows me would say, oh, you know, I'm pretty much the same I was when I started. I wasn't smart enough to try and alter my behaviour or attitude. And, you know, one thing that I think, if I was successful at learning, is that when you're putting new cultures and companies together, you've got to be very equal-handed. So when we did Zenith Optimedia, you know, the management team was deliberately taken, even though I had a passion and a historic commitment and loyalty to Zenith, the management team was made up very equally from people from Optimedia and Zenith. And then you know, having been on that Publicis board, we had Zenith Optimedia, we had Starcom and MediaVest, that titan of media in the US. We had a thing called Viva Key, which you might remember, Marco.
Very successful.
Very, very successful. Third leg of the stool. And, you know, for various, and those two businesses were kept very separate. Yes. And why were they kept separate? Because we had some very, very tough, overlapping, conflicting clients. Yeah. And then it got to the point where Maurice said, look, you know, we need to make a single leader here. And he asked me to take that on. And, and that was hugely challenging because, you know, I think everybody knows the strongest competitor for Zenith Optomedia was Starcom MediaVest and vice versa. And he said, look, you know, you need to come up with a plan. And, you know, the house was on fire at the time, as you'll remember.
Yeah.
And so I said, look, you know, give me 90 days. And I went round and saw a whole load of the clients. I tried to work with some of the people at SMG. I basically moved back to the US, you know, and again, that learning that I'd had from taking on Zenith Optomedia, which had grown sort of probably fivefold in the time that we'd been leading it and managing it. And I did the same thing again. I basically created a management team, and you might remember we took that nascent team, and I think we had a board of 12 or 14, and we took 6 or 7 from the 2 organizations. And that even-handedness to show that I wasn't being particularly
took a bit of heat off
partial to one side or the other. And similarly, you know, that thing I mentioned about having a really clear positioning in the marketplace, and I went to see a whole load of the really biggest clients and the consultants. Some of the clients were not ours, and at the time there was a huge cloud in the industry, and it was all about people didn't trust the digital ecosystem, and a lot of them didn't trust the agency and the way the agency is behaving. So we set our stall out and said, look, you know, we are going to be a different new organization. We had first mover advantage with Zenith, and in which everyone said, oh, that was amazing. In fact, that was a hindrance because all the other competitors set out and said, well, we're not going to be Zenith. We're going to be something different and better. So we actually had last mover advantage because by the time we created Publicis Media, everybody else had consolidated media and Omnicom Media Group and Group M and IPG and Havas and Dentsu. So actually having last mover advantage was a really good thing. But given the environment it was, you go and see the clients, they said, look, you know, we're not sure we've got a trusting relationship with the media channels we're engaging with. We're not sure we really trust the contractual, you know, all these things going on, you know, undisclosed arbitrage, you know, our agencies using a barter company. So I said, right, we're going to have a very clear positioning for Publicis Media, which is we're going to stand for 3 things. And it's going to be about trust, talent and transformation. And that became the mantra for the whole organization. So we still have Zenith as the RO agency. We still had Starcom. We still had MediaVest, which then became Spark. And so we had different leaders. And they said, look, we've got to simplify this business. It's way too complicated. All the agencies have made different acquisitions in different markets. So we simplified that business, and we said we're going to be a brand-led organization supported by global practices. We consolidated everything that we could at the center, like trading, investment, talent, data. So all of these were shared. We still have brand leadership, but we removed all of the P&Ls. And that sort of began to create a much more unified, collaborative behaviour between those brands, which before were eating each other's lunch.
Do you think that was the bedrock then for the whole of then group?
Well, certainly so that was the Publicis Media thing. So that was from sort of 2015, 2016. And because of that positioning and and the talents that we had, and we got everyone to work together well. And so, you know, we took, who's the best person to new business? And it was a lady called Lauren Hammerhand, now ran Zenith, for example. Who's the best talent person? So, you know, we took the best talent, which happened to be Severine. And so, you know, we identified the best leaders and put those in the positions, gave them very clear KPIs. And then from having done that, obviously Maurice announced his succession. He was going to step down, and Artur Sadoun became the CEO of Publicis Group, and said to me, look, he wants for some reason, best known to himself, he said, I want you to be the COO. I said, I'm going to be a terrible COO. So I was the CEO overseeing at the time media, production, content and commerce. So 4 really disparate areas. But to your point, Rachel, you know, we sort of follow the same plan, as you know. We said, look, you know, we're going to create the power of one. And what that meant is that we're going to eliminate all of these hundreds of P&Ls, and we're really going to focus really on 2 things. One is the country P&L, and 2 is on key client P&Ls. It's a very different direction. Most people in the industry thought this would be an absolute disaster. There would have been exodus of staff, there would have been exodus of clients. And then, of course, this took us into 2019 when we were executing this plan. and it was really, really tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
There was definitely a moment.
and, you know, we then made the decision to pull out of Cannes for a year,
Yeah,
not
I
to do
remember.
that. And we then decided to invest, funny enough, in AI and build the Marcel platform. And it was just brutal. It was just really tough. We managed to win, at the time, the biggest client pitch we'd ever had, which was Disney, which we won globally. And that was a big sort of, you know, which we really had virtually no relationship with Disney at the time. And we put data at the center of our proposition. We acquired Epsilon. But then COVID happened and the market cap value of Publicis went down from about 10 to about 5, you know, as all companies dropped, a bit like it's happening right now with Trump tariffs. And so it went down to 5, and we paid $4 billion for the acquisition of Epsilon. So you think, God, are we going to survive this? And it was tough. You know, our shares went down to 20 euros. But we had that plan, and then went on to do that plan. But we were doing this sitting in attics at home doing that. And it was, funny enough, of all the jobs I've had, that one, the most latterly, the most senior, was without doubt the most toughest, the loneliest.
Yeah.
Artur, my boss, obviously got sick during that time, as everybody knows, with cancer. But he continued working through that, you know, so that was a very, very tough moment. And, you know, I think everyone goes, oh, look at Publicis now, you know, the market cap, pre-tariff, you know, went from about 5 to about 27 billion. Look where we are now in terms of trajectory. Look at the acquisitions. It's an amazing story, but don't think
it wasn't easy, was it?
No.
I was going to say, so was that your toughest time in your career, do you think, when you were sat in your attic on your own? Because you're such a people person.
That's
your
exactly right.
energy, you get energy. You can feel it even in here. It's sat in your attic is not.
Yeah, I mean, and at a personal level, Artur got sick with cancer. I got shingles. I'd never been ill, ever.
Yeah.
And, you know, people go, oh, you know, this work-life balance, I think, as you both know, I think I'd always managed that well, you know, and...
well, there's no start and no end, was there, when you're at home?
And,
it's just all work.
You know, I'm still happily married and, you know, 5 kids are great. But, you know, that time sitting in those attics, as everyone did, you know, it was tough for everybody. You know, it was tough, it didn't matter. You know, you think of the mental damage that wrought on people. I think of people, whether they were grandparents not seeing their children, or lots of people working for me who had young kids, bringing up kids in flats and apartments. It was a terrible, terrible time. And that's, so to your point, Rachel, 100%, that was such a tough, brutal...
It's lonely at the top.
It is.
Yeah.
And then if you put that on top... I remember us meeting by the pool at Soho House in White City it was probably coming out, it must have been coming out at the back end of... But I remember walking away from there thinking it's the first time I'd seen you where you weren't the image Steve King, in terms of like you were a bit more.
Well, you look great now.
Thoughtful.
Did you not look about this?
He's always tanned, so I don't know about that. But you were more. I felt like you'd been through something. Yeah,
it was brutal. You know, and you know, and that's where, you know, people talk lightly. Oh, we know we've done a transformation, which Publicis has done, and it was the right thing to do. And I think some of our competitors, you know, can say we're going to do the same thing. They don't want to say we're doing a
trying to do the
same thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, and this was driven by Artur, supported by me, but it was really tough. And the good thing, you know, particularly on the media side, is we had gone through that re-engineering before then. So the bit of the business, and that was on a tear, continued on a tear.
Yeah.
But, you know, I was dealing with talents and people I didn't know, and you're having lots of tough conversations with people, as you know, dozens of people, hundreds of people, when you're not sitting with them. So it's one thing saying to someone, I'm sorry, you know, we're not continue working with you, when you're sitting face to face. It's another thing when they're doing it, they're worried about their future, and you're having tough conversations about the future doesn't look so good to them when you're sitting disconnected, discombobulated.
Yeah. And how did you, so you obviously had to like dig deep. What did you turn to like help you through that? I mean, apart from obviously your family and, you know, that's a support, but what did you turn to at that time?
I think, I don't know. There was no secret source.
Yeah.
You know,
you have mentors? I mean, you know,
I think I wouldn't say I've got many fantastic life skills, But one thing I do have is tenacity, and you've just got to get up every day, and whether I've lost a big pitch or lost someone's resigned or whatever, or an acquisition's going wrong, you've just got to brush yourself down. And that sort of, I almost think having a very bad short-term memory. I forgot what happened yesterday. You've got to get up, and there's going to be good things. Yeah. And and I remember back in the very, very early days, when this is going back to the Zenith, the very early days. One of the big first pitches we got here in the UK is we were pitching for the COI. You remember,
the government.
I don't know if it's a big thing now, but the COI, the government had the biggest client by far. And we thought we had a great story. Unfortunately, the people who were making the decision about this, well, unfortunately, they'd all been fired by my CEO, you know who that was, and they were all the decision makers at the COI. I don't know why we didn't think that might count against us. And so, this was people, I think it was Tim Greatrex and Tom George, working with me, and we didn't win it. And we'd spent 6 months working on that. And afterwards, I remember we all went to lunch. Tim Jones was there, head of clients, and he went on to be the CEO of
US.
America's, worked with me for the next 30 years. And we went to lunch. I said, guys, what are we going to do? We thought, we'd never. I said, we got to take on a challenge. And we all signed up for the London Marathon. And that was the 1994 London Marathon. And
was that your first?
And that was my first.
And you're doing it again?
And I think 4 out of the 5 of us did it. And I saw Tim Greatrex, who I mentioned, who obviously I hadn't worked with for another 25 years. And thinking about that mentorship, obviously you need to have good relationships with your boss, as you know. The number one reason people, seniors, execs, leave their role is not because of salary, not because of working conditions. It's because of poor relationship with their boss. Yeah. And I've been very lucky. I have had very, very tough, smart, driven, but great bosses. I've had a couple of terrible ones, but they were very short-lived, who one or two of them were. But generally, 95% of my career, I have bosses who I completely respected. And that's certainly the case for Maurice and certainly the case for Artur. And I think they lead by example.
Yeah, exactly.
And, there's been a big shift. When I started out, the best talents, frankly, were in the UK. It was a more, because of the way, we had a licensee paid media. We had, it was the fastest penetration of digital, lots of the global trends emanated from the UK. We had the best research in the world. So we created comms planning, created account planning. Yeah. And that's why people like me were lucky enough to say, we're going to give this guy an opportunity. And lots of the other people who went to go and run WPP or Omnicom came from the UK. There has definitely been a shift, and the UK does not have any sovereignty over talent or leadership now. And you go to the US, and I can tell you the leadership, the quality of talent, the people it's attracted, and particularly because the big platforms originate from the US. Yeah. The sophistication, the entrepreneurship is so different. So I think that position might have been
advise people to go over there. If people are thinking about progression.
So I would say 20 years ago, I spent as many times going to China as I went to US. Yeah. And that was a place. I'd say you've got to go to China. That is the market. You think what it's happening with digital, with technology, e-commerce, cashless society. And some of the best and brightest people went to Asia. Jerry Bohr, for example, I persuaded to go and take on the Asia role from running Zenith in the UK. Really good example. But I think now you'd say, it's really hard to be a credible global leader if you have not experienced working in America with Americans. And I can't see the polarization towards American business in the media industry. All the streamers predominantly are American. The platforms are all American. Look at the influence of Trump on global affairs, and global finances. And, and ironically, globalization is probably dead. You're seeing the rise of nationalism and protectionism. So the answer to your question, Marco, definitely I would say yes. You cannot. And I talk to some of the people who are in our UK business or European business, and they go to the US and go, oh my God, the IQ level and the quality of talent there is so different to it was 5 or 10 years ago, which was definitely not the case just 10 years ago.
Yeah. And just going back to, so obviously under Maurice and then Artur, I was just going to ask you about the biggest thing you learnt from them. Obviously, so from Maurice, it was around the win. And if somebody, somebody else got to lose, and that passion, I think I can see it in the three of you, Maurice, Artur and yourself. But what did you specifically learn from Artur?
I mean, it's interesting because you think most of the leadership at the advertising holdcos are generally business people or finance leads, John Rance and Martin Sorrell.
Yeah.
And Artur comes from running a creative agency, most awarded creative agency at Cannes. So he had a very different mentality. He is unrelenting about his passion for clients. I'm sure he talks a greater proportion. I have no doubt he talks to his client, our clients, their clients, more than any of our competitors. I didn't think I'd ever meet anybody who works more passionately than Maurice and harder. 133 in Champs-Élysées. Maurice will be there 6, if not 7 days a week. And he is definitely, Artur is definitely working at a different cadence than Maurice. And passion for clients, for pitching, for winning, for obviously spending a lot of time in the US, traveling unrelentingly. Yeah, I think so. That
is that
passion, commitment, and attention for detail.
Yeah.
That's a big thing. You look at so many successful business people in different categories, from Steve Jobs to, Zuckerberg. They're people who've never given up their craft skills. So that attention to detail.
The devil's in the detail.
Devil in the detail.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's really hard to sort of go that they're in that job because of that, but can you be in that job and not be like that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, is it just a given that if you're running an organisation the size of Publicis, you have to basically work 6 or 7 days a week? And
I mean, when I had my very nice leaving lunch from Publicis and with the supervisory board on the 7th floor, you've probably been there.
Been there a couple of times.
Overlooking the Champs-Élysées. There's no better advertising offices anywhere in the world, as you both know. And obviously a very nice, gracious lunch where they thanked me for whatever I had achieved. And Maurice made a point saying, it's nice of Steve to be here because he's always on holiday. And I definitely, it's not to say I have many, many interrupted vacations, but I think one of the reasons I kept my sanity and energy is I did know that I needed to have a work-life balance. And I didn't have that unrelenting, definitely was extremely tenacious, but I definitely had a work-life balance, and I needed to have that with a wife and 5 kids. And, I said, one of the things I was proudest about, I never missed when my 2 boys were playing rugby on a Wednesday. I would arrange board meetings or new business pitches, and this, I'd fly back from China and then fly off to the US or whatever.
You did crazy.
And so that work-life balance was, to me, that was really an important thing. And I'm not going to be on my deathbed going, I wish I'd worked harder.
Yeah. You have worked incredibly hard, though. Let's be around the bush.
It's levels, but
just managed to fit it all in.
I remember always reflecting that somehow, and admittedly, maybe for some people that would be stressful, but somehow you managed to always fit in some enjoyment time, let's just call it that, with all the work. And, I remember being at CS once, and it was like, I don't know, 4 PM, and you were running through the lobby on the way to the gym or something. And I was just thinking, you scheduled it in. It didn't matter where it fitted in the day, as long as you found time to create some of that balance. So I think that's...
But that's about performance, isn't it? Like, if you go to the gym, you perform better outside of that.
Yeah, I think that's partly it. And it's also about relationships. It's really important that in work and life, you've got balanced relationships with everybody.
Yeah.
And, I think having that balance, was really important. I think one of the things, if I was good at something, it was giving people clear responsibilities and saying, this is what you need to deliver. Okay, I've got it. And then I would leave them to deliver against that. And then if we were failing against those KPIs, it's not quite right. What are we going to do to fix that? So I wasn't micromanaging people, and I spent a lot of time trying to make sure, as Jim Collins says, in Good to Great, we got the right people in the right seats, wrong people off the bus, and then we decide where to take the bus. So it's people first, always. And the media business, or certainly the media business, perhaps not quite the case in the wider advertising, but in the media business, it was really always about two things. And it was about scale and talent. And, you know, if you've got scale, you can get the best talent.
Yeah.
But you really need to have those two things. And now there are other areas, probably it's technology and data, but
it's the essence of leadership.
It's about those two things.
Yeah.
It's
but
about
trust
those
them
two
to deliver them, like give them the trust to deliver
and give them a
trust
clear
them.
proposition.
Yeah.
So, you know, once you've established the ROI agency, it's about trust, talent and transformation. And now I'm working with 2 or 3 other businesses. And I said, what's your proposition? Oh, it's like that. And I go, okay, I'll go and talk to the guy in the US or go and talk to a person in India. And if they're not all saying, oh, the business is about this, he goes, you've got a bit of a problem here. You've got to have absolute clarity. When you think about the world's greatest businesses, well, I don't know, it's Apple or Samsung or P&G or L'Oreal or any of there's a real clarity internally and externally about what they stand for, the type of behavior, what their products stand for, the type of leadership. And that clarity and consistency is so important. If you've got that, it's much easier to lead a business, you know. And Publicis, when I was leading Publicis Media, but about 32,000 people and a Publicis group as a whole, we were managing better part of 90,000 people.
Yeah, and they're all on the same. They know what they had to deliver. We do ask every week, because I'm just thinking about the hundreds and thousands of clients that you must have spoken to. We always ask about what was your Magpie moment, or where do you know when you've been speaking to people. Is there something that you've seen, the way somebody did something or what they said, that you went, I'm going to take that, I'm going to steal with pride and take that into my organisation or my life?
I think you won't. I think I've already commented those two things. It's about having real clarity about what a business is about. So really simplifying that. That's the first thing, which I got from Bill Grimes when I was sitting in the US. And secondly, about listening well, making sure you spend more time, as we said. Listen. You don't need to go into a meeting and speak. And thirdly, it's all about talent. Talent then, talent now. Recruiting the best talent and giving them roles that they're resourced to do, giving them clear KPIs, and then trusting them to deliver against that.
Yeah, that's great.
One of the things that I think over the years, you've had quite a tight-knit group of people that you've worked with amongst many thousands, but there's been a tight-knit group there. One of the person you're sort of synonymous with is Adrian Salis as a sort of, I know you're going to, who? He's been your partner in crime for forever, basically. And so I guess you're part mentoring each other in that sense, like where you get help and support from. But would you, again, is that, I mean, how did that work for you? And is that something you would say to people, like, if you can find someone
your Adrian.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I think you needed to find different people to do different roles.
Yeah.
So there's no point having somebody like me managing technology or data or clients or new business. You needed to find people who...
What's their superpower?
What is their superpower? And for me, the things that I was not good at, Adrian, who, if people who don't know, was our CFO and commercial partner. He was a COO for a long time with me. He was a CFO, and in fact, 1 or 2 of my projects now, he left Publicis a year before me. I'm now, as you know, working with him. And I think that trusting relationship, and a couple of times he comes and says, oh, I've really screwed up here, and oh my God, I think you're gonna have to get rid of me. I go, look, we can all screw up, you know. And so I think that, you know, having those complementary skills, there's no point just having substitutional skills. You need to have a team that complements each other, and I think that's where
have a realization of what you're good at, and then if you haven't got it, you find the right people to...
So, it's a diversity
as you know, I think probably coming to Adrian's, somebody said at Adrian's leaving party, Steve sells shit to clients, Adrian works out how on earth we're going to deliver it and make money out of it.
That is a good one.
Steve, thanks so much.
Pleasure.
That was we could go on for hours.
Really appreciate it.
Marco,
have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Marco, we are coming to our final advice, and you know how much I love this book by Richard Reed. If I could tell you just one
really
thing,
need to be sponsored, or
we should. Richard, I think Richard should just come on. Yeah,
we'll get
the podcast. But I suppose inspired by Steve's thirst for always learning, for always looking to keep his brain active. I mean, he's not going to stop. He's not retired. He's basically going to be.
He's learnt more in the last few whatever's.
Yeah.
He's
going to be busier than ever.
Learning.
But actually, that's from this guy called David Eagleman. He is actually he's a brain neuroscientist. He lives in Palo Alto. He's incredibly brainy, and he said that the secret to keep the brain electrically alive, and that comes from maintaining a level of curiosity to get a big thrill out of learning new things. And the good news, there is no end to that. What we know is so shockingly little, and the rest of all that is uncharted waters. And then he goes on to say, and this is his advice, stay keenly aware of the vastness of our ignorance. There is so much we don't know. We really put the effort into scraping the edges of our knowledge. And remember, the most interesting, rewarding and fascinating thing is to be wrong. To discover, oh, I thought I was right, but now I am seeing something that I hadn't seen before. So be prepared to listen to that voice inside that says, I really know very little about what's happening here. That humility will help you learn. And I think we've heard a lot, haven't we, about actually you learn more through your mistakes. Yes. You don't know everything.
Steve said it.
Yeah.
Others have said it. Yeah. Like sit in meetings, you don't have to rattle on, just listen and
be curious. Be curious. Keep your keep the electric bits going in your brain.
Talking of brainy, is it true that you went to Cambridge University?
I did. I don't talk about
you
that. I don't talk about that too much. Yeah. Well, yes, I did. I mean, I don't know how you can sit next to me.
What did you study?
Geography.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is not about us. This is not anyway.
Erosion.
This is
no
human geography.
Okay.
Civilizations and urbanization.
Oh, cool. What did you get? What was your
2-1?
2-1. That's good. I got 2-1.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Don't forget, we love to hear all about your mentors.
Join us next time for more pearls of wisdom from Mentor.
Mentor is a Viral Tribe entertainment production. Don't forget to give us a follow on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. Until next time.
Thank you.